We're going to look at Mark chapter 15. We're going to look at the first 15 verses about the moment when a crowd calls for Jesus' crucifixion. And this is a really dramatic moment because this is the crowd of Israel. They're looking at their king. They're looking at the one that God has sent for them to be their Messiah. And instead of asking for him to be lifted up on a throne, they ask for him to be lifted up on a Roman cross. It's a humiliating rejection. And if you think about the rejection of Christ, sometimes I wonder, why doesn't Jesus just show up to everybody in the world and then everybody would believe? If he held a press conference and said, I'm God, everyone believe in me, in my mind, I'm kind of like, yeah, that would work. Why do we have to preach the word? Why do we have to evangelize? And if you think about it, though, Jesus did show up. We forget that. He's literally there in the flesh to his own people, and he's rejected. So seeing isn't always believing. And that's an important thing that we can learn from this passage, that unbelief is more than just a lack of physical evidence, but there's something wrong with our hearts. That ultimately we don't believe because we're blinded by our own sin. And seeing, apart from God's grace, actually leads to rejection. And we're going to see that in Mark 15, in the first 15 verses. Read along with me. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him!" And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. There's three examples of rejection due to sin in this passage. The first is from the priests. The priests reject Jesus out of envy. They're jealous that Jesus Christ is gaining this momentum and this prestige from the people around him. They don't like that he's being elevated as a teacher in Israel. And so they're envious of his status. And so they trump up these false charges, and they essentially say that he's trying to challenge the power of Rome by being a rebel. He's threatening to blow up the temple. He's sort of this local religious zealot / terrorist type figure. And they're trumping up these false charges. The second example of unbelief is in the crowd. They ask for Jesus to be crucified out of pure hatred. Hatred blinds us to logic and reason. They know that he's done nothing wrong, and yet they're full of this mob mentality. They just go with the crowd, the sentiment of the people, and they are against him. They're blinded by their hatred, and they believe the lies of the chief priests. And the final example of unbelief is Pilate. Pilate is apathetic. He knows that Jesus is innocent. He even wonders, hey guys, are you sure you want to crucify Jesus? Why not Barabbas? Barabbas actually is a murderer, and he actually is a religious terrorist type. And instead they choose Barabbas to go free. And Pilate lets that injustice continue. He doesn't intervene. He just lets injustice take its course, and he doesn't want to ruffle any feathers. He just wants everything to go smoothly. So his comfort rationalizes in his mind, well, I'm not going to get involved with this. I'm just going to let this evil go undealt with. And so Pilate is apathetic. So envy, hatred, apathy, this is the reason that we don't want to believe Christ, that we don't want to follow him. We're envious of God's position and his authority in our life. We want to call the shots. We have hatred that we are accountable to him, that he will judge us for our sin, that he cares about how we live our lives. And we're also apathetic many times. We think we're self-sufficient. We don't need God. We want to be self-dependent. So these are the things that blind us to belief apart from God's grace. And yet, what's amazing is Jesus doesn't open his mouth. He doesn't speak out for himself. He doesn't defend himself, but he submits himself to the will of the Father. Why? Because in response to our hatred, our envy, and our apathy, he acts in love. In response to our sin, he acts in love. And there's a word for that in the Bible: grace. And this is the most amazing thing. Despite our rejection, despite our sin, despite all of the animosity we had towards Jesus throughout our entire lives, Jesus Christ still lays down his life for us. That's grace. And that is what compels us to follow him and to love him, because he lays down his life for his friends. Leave a comment or leave a question and share this with your friends.